Imagine being forced to work every single day with no pay, no freedom, and no hope for the future. In ancient Rome, this was the life of millions of slaves. Their lives were often filled with suffering, but also moments of surprising resilience and strength. This is a story of how slaves lived in the Roman Empire. It's a history that might shock you, but it's one you won't forget. Let's take a deep dive into their world. The Roman Empire, often remembered for its grandeur and military dominance, was also built on one very ugly truth: the exploitation of slaves. Slavery was not a small part of Roman society. It was a backbone of an entire economy and social structure. If you picture ancient Rome, with its marble buildings, grand feasts, and armies marching through the streets, it's important to remember that much of that prosperity was maintained by the labor of enslaved people. Whether it was the fields, the homes of the rich, the arenas, or the mines, slaves were everywhere in Roman society. Slavery in Rome was not like the slavery we often think of when we hear the word today. In the Roman world, slavery was not based on race. Slaves came from many different backgrounds. Some were prisoners of war, some were born into slavery, and others sold themselves or their children into servitude to pay off debts. There was no escape for most. Slavery was seen as a permanent condition, a status that could not be changed, even by the most talented or hard-working individuals. So, let's delve deeper into what life was truly like for these slaves, the hardships they faced, the work they did, and the resistance they exhibited. The origins of slavery in Rome. Slavery in ancient Rome had multiple sources. Most slaves were captured in war. As Rome expanded its borders, its military campaigns left a trail of destruction, and part of that destruction involved taking prisoners. These prisoners were often turned into slaves. Entire villages, cities, and territories were conquered by the Romans, and the people captured were forced into servitude. These prisoners came from all parts of the known world. Whether it was the Celts of Gaul, the Greeks from the east, the Carthaginians from North Africa, or the Egyptians, no region was spared from the horrors of enslavement. But it wasn't just war prisoners who ended up in chains. Many people were born into slavery. If your mother was a slave, you were born a slave, and that was your life. Other times, slavery was a result of poverty or debt. In a cruel twist, if a person could not repay a debt, they would have to sell themselves or even their children into slavery. It was a desperate act, but often the only way out of financial ruin. Even though many slaves were captured or born into servitude, slavery wasn't static. Some people were able to buy their freedom by saving up enough money or earning enough in their service to negotiate a release. But for the majority of slaves, the hope of freedom was nothing more than a fantasy. Most were kept under lock and key by their masters, with no chance of ever being able to escape their fate. Types of slaves and their work. In ancient Rome, the role of a slave depended on their skills, their master, and the location in which they worked. Slaves could be found in every walk of Roman life, from the fields to the kitchens, from the mines to the temples. Let's explore some of the different types of slaves and the work they did. Agricultural slaves. The backbone of Rome's food production, agricultural slaves worked on vast estates called latifundia. These estates were the Roman version of a plantation and were often owned by wealthy elites. Agricultural slaves toiled under grueling conditions. They planted crops, harvested grain, and tended to animals. The work was backbreaking, and in many cases, it was done under the brutal Roman sun, day after day. They worked long hours, with little time for rest, and they lived in harsh conditions. The food they ate was basic, and their shelters were often no more than crude huts. Many agricultural slaves died young due to exhaustion, disease, and poor living conditions. Household slaves. These slaves worked in the homes of the wealthy. They performed domestic chores like cooking, cleaning, and serving their masters. The conditions for household slaves varied depending on their master. Some lived in relatively comfortable quarters, while others were confined to dark, cramped spaces with no privacy. They were often subject to the whims of their masters, who could treat them with kindness one moment and lash out in cruelty the next. While these slaves may have had better food and more comfortable living arrangements than agricultural slaves, they were still very much under control of their masters. Their lives were consumed by constant service to their owners. Skilled slaves. Not all slaves were unskilled laborers. Some were highly skilled in a craft or profession. These slaves might work as builders, carpenters, blacksmiths, musicians, doctors, or even teachers. Skilled slaves were often more highly valued by their masters and, in some cases, might be given better treatment. Some skilled slaves had the ability to earn money or gain special privileges. But even these slaves were still considered property. While they might have been more comfortable than their unskilled counterparts, they lived with the constant reminder that they were still owned by someone else. Mining slaves. The worst job for any slave in ancient Rome was to work in the mines. Slaves who worked in the mines lived in horrendous conditions. The work was dangerous and exhausting. They worked in dark, narrow tunnels, often with little ventilation, and breathed in toxic fumes. Many died young from exhaustion, injury, or disease. The Romans relied heavily on slaves to work in their mines, extracting precious metals, salt, and other valuable resources. The slaves who worked in the mines were often worked to the bone, with little regard for their health or safety. Gladiators. Perhaps the most famous group of slaves in Rome were the gladiators. These men, often prisoners of war or slaves, were forced to fight in the arena for the entertainment of the Roman public. Gladiators were trained to fight in little schools, where they were taught to battle with swords, shields, and other weapons. The gladiatorial games were brutal, bloody spectacles, and many gladiators died in their first fight. Those who survived would become famous, but their lives were always at risk. Winning in the arena didn't mean freedom. Most gladiators remained slaves, fighting until they died. The brutal treatment of slaves. Life for slaves in ancient Rome was often marked by extreme cruelty. Slaves were considered property, not people, and were subject to their master's whims. A master could beat, punish, or even kill a slave without facing any consequences. In many cases, punishment was severe. Slaves who attempted to escape could be branded, mutilated, or killed. Even minor offenses could result in violent punishment. However, not all masters were cruel. Some Roman slave owners treated their slaves relatively well, especially those who worked in their homes. These masters might have provided their slaves with better food, more comfortable living conditions, and occasional rest. But no matter how kind or generous the master, the slave's fate was always in the hands of another. Slaves could be sold at any time, torn away from their families, and sent to a new master. Slave revolts and resistance. While most slaves had no power to change their fate, there were moments in Roman history when they fought back. One of the most famous instances of resistance was the Spartacus rebellion in 73 BCE. Spartacus, a gladiator, led a group of slaves in a revolt against their Roman masters. The rebellion quickly grew in size, as thousands of slaves joined the cause. For 2 years, Spartacus and his army of runaway slaves fought the Roman legions in a series of battles. Their revolt struck fear into the heart of the Roman Empire. Despite their success in battle, the rebellion was eventually crushed. Spartacus was killed, and the surviving rebels were either killed or crucified as punishment. But the Spartacus rebellion became a symbol of resistance and defiance, reminding the world that even in the most oppressive systems, there are always those who will fight for their freedom. Other forms of resistance, though less dramatic, were common. Slaves would sometimes sabotage their work, damage property, or secretly help others escape. The resistance of slaves may not have always been visible, but it was a constant, underlying force. The social status of slaves in Rome. Slaves in ancient Rome had no legal rights. They were considered the property of their masters, no different from livestock or tools. Their status as property was absolute. They could be bought, sold, punished, or killed without any recourse. Slaves had no voice in Roman society, and their lives were dictated by the will of their masters. Despite their lack of rights, slaves were critical to the functioning of Roman society. They made up a significant portion of the population, and the wealth of the Roman elite was built on their labor. While slaves were at the bottom of the social ladder, the wealthy depended on them to maintain their luxurious lifestyles. Without slaves, Rome's economy would have collapsed, and much of the empire's power would have been impossible to sustain. The legacy of slavery in ancient Rome. Slavery in ancient Rome was an essential part of the empire's success, but it came at a tremendous human cost. Slaves were the lifeblood of the Roman economy, yet they were treated as mere commodities, not human beings. The legacy of slavery in ancient Rome is a reminder of how deeply embedded exploitation can become in a society and how it can sustain an empire for centuries. While slavery in Rome is a dark chapter of history, it also shows the resilience and spirit of the people who lived through it. The rebellions, the small acts of resistance, and the enduring fight for freedom are powerful testaments to the strength of the human spirit, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Further examination of the life of slaves in Rome. Slavery in ancient Rome was pervasive, and while we've already discussed the grueling work slaves did and the extreme conditions they faced, it's also important to examine their relationship with their masters and the cultural mindset surrounding slavery. Slaves in Roman society, cultural and legal views. In ancient Rome, slavery was so deeply ingrained that it was considered a natural part of life. Roman citizens, from the patricians to the plebeians, depended on slaves to maintain their daily routines, their wealth, and even their sense of status. Roman law considered slaves to be property, not human beings. This was codified in legal texts with the Corpus Juris Civilis, which explicitly stated that slaves were living property. Masters had full control over the lives of their slaves, and there were very few legal protections for slaves within the Roman system. It wasn't just the wealthy elite who owned slaves. Even middle-class Romans could own one or two slaves. Wealthy landowners often had hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves to maintain their estates, and these slaves were treated as tools to be used and discarded at will. Roman society viewed slaves as a necessary part of their civilization. They didn't see them as human beings with emotions or desires, but as a labor force that existed to fulfill the needs of free citizens. While there were occasional legal protections to prevent excessive cruelty, these were more like recommendations, not enforceable rights. If a master was cruel, there was little to stop them from punishing their slaves as they saw fit. Slave families, separation and survival. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of slavery in ancient Rome was a constant threat of family separation. Since slaves were considered property, families were frequently torn apart by sales. If a slave family's master decided to sell, they could be forced to leave behind their spouse, children, or parents. This harsh reality meant that relationships between slaves were fragile. There was always a looming possibility that someone in a slave's family would be sold off to another master far away. Despite this constant threat of separation, slaves did manage to form families and communities. In large estates, multiple slaves would often live in close quarters, and these slave communities created their own forms of solidarity. They helped each other with tasks, shared stories, and, when possible, offered each other comfort in difficult times. In some cases, slaves even managed to create their own families outside of the direct family structure. They might be placed together for a specific task or be part of a household group and form close bonds through shared suffering. These bonds were important, as they gave slaves a sense of identity and community, even though they had no formal rights. Manumission, the hope of freedom. Though rare, some slaves had the opportunity to gain their freedom. This process was known as manumission. A master could grant a slave freedom for various reasons. For example, a slave who had shown exceptional loyalty, skill, or service could be freed as a reward. In other cases, a slave could purchase their freedom if they were able to save up enough money. The act of manumission was significant because it was one of the few ways a person could escape slavery in ancient Rome. If a slave was manumitted, they were no longer considered property. However, even freed slaves faced challenges. While they gained their legal freedom, many freed slaves still lived in poverty and had to work in difficult jobs to survive. They could never truly erase their status as former slaves, and they were often looked down upon by freeborn citizens. Manumission also had its limits. A freed slave still could not hold political office or marry into the highest social classes. Even though they were free, their opportunities were often limited by their past status as a slave. While manumission was a form of freedom, it didn't guarantee equality within Roman society. Slaves in the gladiatorial arenas, a life of death. Gladiatorial combat was one of the most brutal aspects of ancient Roman culture, and it's important to understand the complete horror faced by those who fought in the arenas. Gladiators, who were often slaves, were trained in little schools where they learned the art of fighting. These schools were like brutal training camps where the men were taught to fight with weapons like swords, tridents, and nets. The life of a gladiator was essentially a life of constant training, preparation, and fear of death. Gladiators were forced to fight in brutal, often fatal, battles for the entertainment of the Roman public. The games were held in massive amphitheaters, like the Colosseum, which could hold tens of thousands of spectators. These public spectacles were not just for entertainment, but were often used as a way for Roman leaders to gain political favor or show their power. Gladiators were treated as less than human, and their lives were seen as expendable. Winning in the arena didn't guarantee freedom for most gladiators. They were still slaves, still owned by their masters, and often continued to fight until they died. Gladiatorial combat wasn't the only type of entertainment that slaves were involved in. Some slaves were forced to perform in the arena as mock soldiers, and others served as animal handlers for the animal hunts that also occurred during these spectacles. The entire gladiatorial culture was fueled by the exploitation of those who were viewed as mere property, subtle resistance, and acts of defiance. While most slaves did not have the power to overthrow the system of slavery, they found subtle ways to resist their fate. This resistance came in many forms, often small but significant. One of the most common ways slaves resisted was through workplace sabotage. Slaves would sometimes damage their tools, spoil food, or perform tasks poorly on purpose. These small acts of rebellion were a way for slaves to express their discontent without directly defying their masters. Though these acts were generally unnoticed by the masters, they were part of a larger undercurrent of resistance among the enslaved population. Other forms of resistance included running away. While it was incredibly difficult to escape, especially because Roman society was so vast and well organized, some slaves managed to escape for a time. They might seek refuge in countryside or join other runaway slaves in hiding. The threat of punishment for a runaway slave was severe. If caught, they were often brutally punished, even killed. But for some, the possibility of freedom was worth the risk. The most famous act of slave resistance was, of course, the Spartacus Rebellion. Spartacus, a gladiator and slave, led one of the most significant slave uprisings in Roman history. Though it was ultimately crushed by the Roman legions, the rebellion became a symbol of the will to resist and fight for freedom. Slaves' contributions to Roman culture. While slaves in ancient Rome were used as tools of labor and often subjected to unimaginable hardship, they were also essential to the creation of Roman culture and infrastructure. From the grand roads, aqueducts, and buildings to the finer arts and literature, slaves played an instrumental role in the daily life of the empire. Slaves were also involved in the creation of art, sculpture, and even some of the most famous Roman literature. Many skilled slaves worked as tutors, philosophers, and artisans, contributing to the intellectual and cultural development of Rome. Despite their status, some slaves gained recognition for their talents, and their work is still admired today. In many ways, slaves helped make Rome the empire it was. Yet, their stories have often been ignored or overshadowed by the larger narrative of Roman greatness. The contributions of slaves are woven into the fabric of Roman culture, from its architecture to its philosophy, but they are often forgotten or erased from the historical record. The life of a slave in ancient Rome is a history too often overlooked, one filled with unimaginable hardship, yet also undeniable strength. Slaves were the silent force that fueled the mighty Roman Empire. They worked the land, built its infrastructure, fought in brutal arenas, and served elites, all while enduring constant cruelty, oppression, and fear. They were owned, controlled, and stripped of their identity. But even in these darkest circumstances, many found ways to resist. Whether through subtle acts of sabotage, silent defiance, or the famous rebellion led by Spartacus, these individuals showed the world that no matter how much power an empire holds, the human spirit can never be fully broken. Their stories aren't just about suffering. They are also about survival, resistance, and the pursuit of freedom against all odds. And while many of these stories have been buried by time, it's crucial to remember them as part of the broader human experience. The suffering endured by slaves in ancient Rome not only built the empire, but also shaped the way we understand justice, equality, and human rights today. By studying the lives of these slaves, we are reminded of the importance of freedom dignity, and respect for every human being, regardless of their station in life. It's a powerful lesson that transcends time and place. If you were moved by the stories of courage, resilience, and resistance from those who lived in the shadows of history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We'll continue bringing untold stories of the past to light, diving into the dark corners of history that are often ignored. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to bringing you more insights from the past in our future videos.